Hello everyone. To start with, a word on why I'm bothering to make a video critique of what is frankly a tiny, insignificant, transphobic YouTube channel like King Critical. Two reasons. First, because my thorough, section-by-section takedown of another philosophical incompetence work, Thomas Bigotry's recently released book, The Nature of the Sexes, Why Biology Matters, shamefully published by Routledge, is a large project that is going to need some more time in the oven to be done to what I would consider to be an acceptable standard of thoroughness. It will be done, by the way. Mr. Bigotry is on Twitter right now gloating at trans people in America having their rights taken away and being terrorized to distract him from the fact that none of his colleagues in philosophy take him seriously, and I very much intend to showcase why. Secondly, because every bad, false, or bigotry-fueled misreading of a philosophical text is an opportunity to explain that text and make some jerk-off look slightly worse and feel worse about themselves for it. Because, by trying to make a name for themselves in a saturated market, pretentious bigots like King Critical actually do us progressives a great service by prying open a debate that capital had seemed up till now to have foreclosed. To put it more briefly, I'm going to talk about King Critical because he's a tool, and he claims to have debunked the Bible of trans ideology. Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. What fun. I've said King Critical was a moron, now I'll start demonstrating it. Here is how King Critical summarizes what he believes is the core argument of gender trouble.
Hi everyone, Transphobia Mantano here, the internet's bastiest queer theory nerd, and this Judith Butler book? It's not good. So I've already covered the main argument of the book in this much better video that I'm linking in the corner now. If you absolutely refuse to watch any of my other videos, dick move by the way, I'll summarize for you. Basically, Butler's entire argument is that the categories of man and woman are performative in the same way social speech acts can be. The issue is, she doesn't actually make an argument for this position and instead relies entirely on equivocating around the word gender. Basically, the term gender can be taken either as meaning the categories of man and woman, or masculinity and femininity. Butler spends the entire book referring vaguely to gender without making it clear in what sense the word is being used. As such, saying, gender is performed. And yeah, well obviously masculinity and femininity are performed, but since we're not brazen sexist, we wouldn't say that femininity is all it takes to make someone a woman, and therefore it doesn't seem obvious that the categories of man and woman are performed. That's equivocation, taking the one term gender and allowing it to simultaneously represent two distinct concepts while implying that what's true of one concept must also therefore be true of the other. Therefore, Butler doesn't make much of an argument, and most of the rest of my video was just me making fun of all the nonsense filler she includes to pad out the page count.
The first thing that stands out to me about this summary of Judith Butler's argument is that Butler doesn't make this argument. Butler doesn't argue that femininity is all it takes to be a woman at all. That is not what performativity means. When Butler says that gender is performative, they are saying something very specific. They are not making the claim that gender is reducible to a set of behaviors that one can put on like a costume to allow one to pass as some category of person in society, like in Shaun of the Dead when they pretend to be zombies to sneak past the undead horde. That wouldn't be philosophically interesting, and if that was the argument the book was making, nobody, including the feminists Gender Trouble is critiquing, would have taken Butler seriously. Rather, what Gender Trouble is primarily interested in is in looking at how gender as a social construct works. What makes gender the kind of thing that insistently appears within a given social linguistic system as a seemingly coherent category, and how it molds that system, how it even in some cases originates key features of that system. Again, just to emphasize how poor a misreading of Gender Trouble this is by King Critical, I doubt he's read it to be honest with you, not only does Butler not argue that merely putting on an act of femininity or masculinity is what is meant by the performativity of gender, the performativity of gender is precisely what makes gender not reducible to these. We'll come back to this later because, as you may have caught in the clip I just showed, King Critical has an earlier video that goes into gender trouble and performativity in more depth. So let's see how he presents Butler's arguments there.
I have mentioned Judith Butler before and responded to her indirectly in videos such as, for example, my response to Philosophy Tube talking about Judith Butler. However, you may well have thought that if Butler was the forerunner for trans ideology and laid down a lot of its philosophical foundations, then I should at some point tackle this book directly. It's a pretty hefty book, 200 pages, which isn't actually that long, but it is pretty long to be responding to the entire book in a YouTube video. So I guess let's jump right into the deep end. I want to talk about performativity. So performativity starts off with a pretty simple premise. There are some vocalizations which are also acts. Standard example is a minister saying, "I now pronounce you man and wife." He is just saying words, but he's also performing an action. He is marrying you. There are certain actions we all understand as actions, but what constitutes performing that action is entirely words. So what are the implications of this for the category of man and woman and the advent of trans ideology? Well, what if gender identity is also a performative speech act? Just like how saying two people are now married can cause them to become married, a biological male saying he's a woman causes him to become a woman.
As you no doubt anticipated, there are many problems with this summary, but I'll start with the biggest one. Again, as in the other video, Judith Butler never makes the argument that King Critical says Butler makes. Butler never says that someone is a given gender just because they say they are. In fact, the very subject of transgender identities doesn't even appear in the book, which you don't even have to read the book to find out, because Butler literally says in the preface in 1999 that if they were to write Gender Trouble now, back in 1999, they would have included a section discussing transgender issues. I highlight this because this is the first of several indications King Critical gives in the course of this video that he hasn't actually read Gender Trouble at all, and is at best relying on cherry-picked quotes out of context in order to make Butler's arguments appear absurd to his viewers, who also have not read the book and will not read the book. I, however, have, which is why I recognized immediately that King Critical in no way has seriously read the text, because not only is the idea of one becoming a gender through simply declaring it to be so, as Lauren Southern once did as a gag when she legally changed her gender in order to fluster random feminists she interviewed on the street.
Did you just call me a woman? I'm legally a man.
Not to be found in Butler's writing. The idea of someone being a gender at all is something Butler argues against directly. It is, in fact, arguably the central argument of the book. King Critical suggests that the reason people would find Butler's arguments compelling despite their apparent absurdity is because they have never encountered performative speech acts before, quote-unquote.
Now, insofar as this argument is able to convince anyone, I imagine it's because they've just never really thought about this idea of performative speech acts before, so now having only just heard about that, they're impressed by this new observation, and in that state of, oh, that's a good point, I've never thought of that before, they are then primed to be much more credulous for the additional claim, and this applies to gender identity. The problem is, if you think about it for a second, just because somebody's introduced you to a new facet of reality that can be the case, doesn't mean it's automatically the case in any given situation. Indeed, the fact you've never even noticed before that sometimes actions can just take the form of speech indicates this isn't usually the case. As such, if someone is going to claim, oh yeah, this thing is a performative speech act that just by dint of being declared causes reality itself to change, they're going to have to provide evidence for making that claim of this specific thing. And yeah, that's the summary of Judith Butler's argument around gender performativity, and pretty much the main argument I've made against it every time I've brought it up on this channel.
The problem is that in saying this, King Critical betrays that he himself does not understand speech act theory, because if he did, he would know that all speech acts are performative. Speech acts are acts that are performed through speech. As in the example King Critical gives, that of a priest marrying a couple through the speech act, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," presuming a heterosexual couple, the act of marrying and the act of pronouncing are the same act. However, if someone, even a priest, were to randomly pronounce people other than the bride and groom to be married, the act of marrying would not be identical to the act of pronouncing that two people are married. This is because in order for speech acts to be successful, or as we might say in speech act theory, felicitous, the actual speaking part of the act, the locution, has to be performed in such a way that it engages a larger social matrix in the correct fashion. Thus, when a priest pronounces two people married who are present for the purpose of being married at a wedding held for them, and both agree to be married in the presence of witnesses, the speech act of marrying the couple will be felicitous. If any of these conditions aren't met, however, the attempted speech act is infelicitous. It didn't work. Allow me to demonstrate. I now pronounce everyone who watches this video to be married to each other. I hope for your sake it didn't work. If it did, my sincerest apologies. That was a felicitous speech act. Since it likely didn't, I'm going to assume that it was in fact infelicitous. By the same token, if I were to declare myself to be a woman randomly, the meaning of woman, quote-unquote, within our social matrix does not allow one's gender to actually be determined by a mere statement that one has such and such a gender, so that declaration is infelicitous. It does not make me a woman if that was my intent. Once again, nobody believes that Lauren Southern is a man, despite the fact that she abused the right in Canada to change one's gender designation on legal documents to troll feminists. Not even Judith Butler. Gender obviously means more than just a bare claim to be such and such, even a legal claim. Otherwise, people wouldn't care about it so much. Note again that every speech act, every one, felicitous or infelicitous, is an act that is performed, and every utterance that makes up a speech act involves the performance of the biological components that make speech possible: tongues, lips, lungs, etc. Speech acts, brace yourselves for this revelation, are spoken. Speaking is a performance. When King Critical refers to performative speech act theory, he puts his ignorance on full display by showing that he doesn't realize that acts are already performative by definition, since all acts are performed. This phrase, performative speech acts, is utterly redundant. It's like calling someone a thieving stealer or a cop policeman. Which brings us to a second way in which King Critical has misunderstood Butler's argument, in that he has incorrectly claimed that Butler regards gender as a speech act, when the point of comparison isn't the fact that gender is expressed with words, because it isn't always expressed with words, but that it is performed in time. Like speech acts, gender is a specific kind of performance within a given social matrix. That is to say, gender is a particular way of acting within a given set of social or linguistic conventions, rules, just as the individual member of a biological species only works as such within a given environment. The gorilla in the family group in the jungle versus a gorilla in the center of the sun. One of these gorillas will function as a gorilla, while the other, tragically, will not. By the by, if you are interested in learning more about speech act theory, I highly recommend J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. It is foundational to the field, and it is wonderfully readable. Pressing on. The argument Butler makes is not that gender is reducible to a speech act, but that gender is itself, like speech acts, enacted. Like acts of all sorts, gender too is performed, which is to say, gender is not a thing that one has, or that one is, or that one wears, but rather, gender is a thing that is done. But this doesn't just go for gender, this goes for everything, including us as humans. We are a performance as well, a performance of specific arrangements of matter within organic and social and non-social and non-organic systems in which they temporarily make a kind of sense in which they work. Thus, on page 185, Butler writes, quote, "That the gendered body is performative suggests that it has no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute its reality. This also suggests that if that reality is fabricated as an interior essence, that very interiority is an effect and function of a decidedly public and social discourse. The public regulation of fantasy through the surface politics of the body, the gender border control that differentiates inner from outer, and so institutes the quote-unquote integrity of the subject. In other words, acts and gestures, articulated and enacted desires, subversive bodily acts create the illusion of an interior and organizing gender core, an illusion discursively maintained for the purposes of the regulation of sexuality within the obligatory frame of reproductive heterosexuality, unquote. It's very important to emphasize here that Butler isn't even claiming that this is their own original argument. Butler is very plainly extending an argument made by Nietzsche concerning the tendency of human intuition to infer the existence of a subject behind every phenomenon, as if the phenomenon must be something in addition to itself to be understood, but to gendering discourse. To quote from Butler again, quote, "Gender is not a noun, but neither is it a set of free-floating attributes. For we have seen that the substantive effect of gender is performatively produced and compelled by the regulatory practices of gender coherence. Hence, within the inherited discourse of the metaphysics of substance, gender proves to be performative, that is, constituting the identity it is purported to be. In this sense, gender is always a doing, though not a doing by a subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed." Quick aside, that gender is a doing but not a doing by a subject directly precludes the possibility of gender being a declaration or a costume, as King Critical suggested in his ridiculous summary of what he thought performativity meant. Continuing, "The challenge for rethinking gender categories outside of the metaphysics of substance will have to consider the relevance of Nietzsche's claim in On the Genealogy of Morals that there is no being behind doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything." In an application that Nietzsche himself would not have anticipated or condoned, we might state as a corollary, there is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results, unquote. And in the name of thoroughness, here is the referred to Nietzsche quote for comparison from the Genealogy of Morals, quote, "Just as ordinary people separate lightning from its flashing and take the latter as its doing as the effect of a subject that is called lightning, so too popular morality separates strength from the expressions of strength, as if behind the strong one there were an indifferent substratum free to express strength or not to, but there is no such substratum. There is no being behind the doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely tacked on as a fiction to the doing. The doing is everything. The people basically double the doing when they have the lightning flashing. This is a doing. It posits the same occurrence once as cause and then once more as effect," unquote. I myself am not actually sure I agree with Butler that Nietzsche would not have condoned this extension of his argument had he lived to read it, although obviously it is true that he did not anticipate it. But again, I digress. The point is that Butler is not only not making the claim that gender is a property that can be conferred on a subject simply by that subject claiming to have some gender identity or other in their heart or their mind. In fact, Butler's argument is that the very coherence of the idea of gender as a part of life is A, confined to and conditioned by definition to a social and linguistic context that makes sense of it in terms of an existing system of signs, and B, that gender is precisely not the kind of thing that someone can be or have as a static property, but is a particular style of behavior within that social system such that, within that system's terms, without necessarily valorizing those terms, they are most appropriately labeled as this category of human who perform the role of that category of human. Even a gender essentialist who believes in evolution should be able to grasp this without difficulty, since sexual dimorphism is itself a biological strategy and a process enacted in time. It is, in a word, as Simone de Beauvoir might have had it, a situation. But even more to the point, it is a situation without a subject behind it. There is no I to claim I am a gender. I am simply a situation. Whether a claim I make about my gender identity is correct or not is entirely dependent on what linguistic game we're playing. On that note, please consider the swallowing. The first essay in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble is entitled Subjects of Sex/Gender/Desire. This is a title filled with densely folded significance. It is not just because it is talking about the subjection of some members of society by other members of society through the mechanism of gender, and it is not simply to indicate that the social use of concepts and categories such as sex, gender, and desire renders them effectively interchangeable. sex being already gendered through the insistence that sex corresponds to a teleological heterosexuality. We are meant to reproduce, which is why sex exists, being the idea, thus making heterosexual desire and therefore heterosexual behavior normative, thereby making sex, which is generally naively understood to be an innocent biological category, into a kind of gendering itself insofar as it describes a role with appropriate behaviors. The title is also, however, meant to implicate subjectivity itself. Subjects of sex gender desire, subjects generated by sex gender desire. As in, the very notion that one is a self that could wear or could be thought to wear gendered behaviors and styles like a literal costume is produced, rather, by gender itself. The very notion that one's core essence as a human being is a thinking, reasoning, seeing thing, and that all else is only secondary to being human, is produced by gender. In this first essay, Butler references a paper by Elizabeth V. Spellman called Woman as Body, Ancient and Contemporary Views, exciting title I know, in which Spellman considers a paradoxical aspect of the dialogues of the Greek philosopher Plato. You see, in Plato's Republic, Plato, speaking through the character Socrates, makes the claim that women should be allowed into ruling positions in society equal to men because the content of their souls, and thus their aptness to be in charge, is not determined by the structure of their bodies. This is a remarkable, even shocking position for an ancient Greek man to take, and almost gives Plato the appearance of being a kind of early predecessor of modern feminism. However, elsewhere, Plato will also regularly insult unvirtuous men by comparing their behavior to that of women. Quoting from Spellman, quote, "It is women who get hysterical at the thought of death. Obviously their emotions have overpowered their reason, and they can't control themselves. The worst possible model for young men could be a woman, young or old, or wrangling with her husband, defying heaven, loudly boasting, fortunate in her own conceit, or involved in misfortune, or possessed by grief and lamentation, still less a woman that is sick in love or in labor." He, referring to Plato, continues, "When in our own lives some affliction comes to us, you are aware that we plume ourselves on our ability to remain calm and endure, in the belief that this is the conduct of a man, and giving into grief that of a woman. To have more concern for your body than your soul is to act just like a woman. Hence the most proper penalty for a soldier who surrenders to save his body when he should be willing to die out of the courage of his soul is for the soldier to be turned into a woman." Unquote. You see, Plato regarded the body and mind as opposed, and indeed even within the soul, there are higher parts and lower parts, and the lower parts, like the body, constantly threaten to overcome the higher parts of the less virtuous soul who is too weak to resist them. Spellman calls this paranoia about the lower parts of the human overtaking the so-called higher parts somatophobia, fear of the flesh. So why did Plato divide the soul in this way such that the bulk of a human being's own body should be seen as an enemy of its soul and a source of fear for the virtuous mind? It actually comes down to something surprisingly banal. Athenian society was rigidly patriarchal. Women were not educated as men were. They were not allowed to speak in the assembly, and they were expected to not associate with men other than their husbands in public. They married and had children extremely young. They had no political rights, really, and being relegated to household duties, their function was essentially to free their husbands from the drudgery of maintaining their own bodily needs so that they could spend their day in public, in important matters, in politics, in war, in the arts, in the market, and so on. Domestic tasks then, as now, were a burden on people who had things to do, careers to pursue, projects to complete, books to ponder, opinions to argue. Thus, women were associated with the bland, hateful mass of burdensome, distracting, necessary tasks that constantly threatened to overwhelm the loftier ambitions of the men. Sickness and emotion, too, like these necessities, threatened to overwhelm men in the same way. The result is that the idea that set in ancient Greek thought about what separates human beings from the beasts, what defines the human soul, are its higher aspirations away from its own bodily existence. What the human does with its head and nothing else is what defines the human, with women being relegated entirely to the domain of less than human animal life, in fact, human life below the neck. Because the head rules on this idea. The body obeys, as master rules slaves, and women are on the side of the body. Hence, Plato's student Aristotle would write, quote, "It is then in an animal, as we were saying, that one can first discern both the sort of rule of a master and political rule. For the soul rules the body with the rule of a master, while intellect rules appetite with political and kingly rule, and this makes it evident that it is according to nature and advantageous for the body to be ruled by the soul, and the passionate part of the soul by intellect, and the part having reason, while it is harmful to both if the relation is equal or reversed. The same holds with respect to man and the other animals. Tame animals have a better nature than wild ones, and it is better for all of them to be ruled by man, since in this way their preservation is ensured. Further, the relation of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior, and ruler to ruled. The same must of necessity hold in the case of human beings generally." Unquote. The idea of the self, or the human spirit, the "I think, therefore I am" of Descartes, thus became identified with the product of gendered subjugation and exploitation. The body was thought not as a part of the full human being, which it is, but as a beastly appendage that the human mind has to contend with, to subjugate, tame, and ultimately to silence. The mind, by contrast, is that which doesn't feel but reasons. It doesn't feel in its heart but sees clearly with its mind's eye. It speaks and argues, but it doesn't digest. It doesn't excrete. It isn't hungry for the things of the body. It is hungry for the things of the gods. And what are the things of the gods? They are the things that are the privilege of men and not of women. A vicious circle. Upshot. Philosophy for 2,000 years has labored under the delusion that an ideological byproduct of a misogynistic slave society is the highest and defining part not only of what it means to be human, but of what it means to be mind. This implicates things like the very idea of God, at least such as we have generally received it. The substance dualist tendency in Western philosophical thought is saturated with misogynistic assumptions of the most base and banal sort, mere artifacts of what men gain when they subjugate women to take over the inconvenient parts of their lives. And so in light of this, you can see how the critical theory of gender isn't just concerned with instituting fairness in society, or with fixing social inequalities. Gender infects even what are generally thought to be the most important parts of philosophy. It can be argued, without exaggeration, that gender is among the most important and formative parts of philosophy in history, in thought period, full stop. This is just one example of the tremendous wealth of insight and interest that critical work on gender and philosophy of gender has to offer. To disregard these as merely concerned with minor issues of only tangential importance for philosophy, or as concerned with mere feelings or temporary social fads is, and I cannot stress this enough, stupid. This has been Consider the Swallowing. Returning to King Critical's later video, there is a simply sublime section which displays his total misunderstanding of the text through his complete unwillingness to actually read or engage with it seriously at all, and it has to do with Butler's argument that heterosexuality is a parody of the idea of a natural original human default with regards to gender.
It sure is interesting learning about sexuality from this philosopher. Page 43. Gay is to straight not as copy is to original, but rather as copy is to copy. The parodic repetition of the original, discussed in the final sections of chapter 3 of this text, reveals the original to be nothing other than a parody of the idea of the natural and the original. Okay, so counterpoint, sexuality is not a parody. My wife and I aren't married as a joke or anything like that. It's not performance art. In fact, me being attracted to women is very much a biological drive, and while in the case of homosexuality it certainly doesn't serve the same biological function, I imagine it's still experientially a similar thing. Why do you have to overcomplicate everything?
Okay, so first of all, Butler didn't argue that being gay was a parody or a joke of heterosexual relationships. King Critical has read this cherry-picked quote so incredibly lazily that he didn't realize it was heterosexuality, not heterosexual relationships, that were being critiqued or parodied as a stabilizing concept for feminist accounts of gender that presume heterosexuality is a kind of primary identity which homosexuality imitates. In this context, the quote-unquote parodic repetition of the original, which quote-unquote reveals the original to be nothing other than a parody of the idea of the natural and the original, is not the existence of heterosexual relationships between men and women, but the idea that heterosexuality itself is primary and natural. As indicated in the passage King Critical just read, this is addressed in greater depth in the final section of the book, in which Butler argues that, quote, if the ground of gender identity is the stylized repetition of acts through time and not a seemingly seamless identity, then the spatial metaphor of a ground will be displaced and revealed as a stylized configuration. Indeed, a gendered corporealization of time. The abiding gendered self will then be shown to be structured by repeated acts that seek to approximate the ideal of a substantial ground of identity, but which in their occasional discontinuity reveal the temporal and contingent groundlessness of this ground, quote-unquote. The possibilities of gendered transformation are to be found precisely in the arbitrary relation between such acts, in the possibility of a failure to repeat, a deformity or a parodic repetition that exposes the phantasmatic effect of abiding identity as a politically tenuous construction, unquote. Now that seems like a mouthful, but if King Critical had actually read the text instead of cherry-picking lines out of context, he would know that in this context, parody doesn't simply refer to jokes, like how Spaceballs spoofs Star Wars by making the lightsaber into a kind of phallus, but to how the false impositioning of heterosexuality as the default model for human relationships, in which the natural state of humankind is to be divided into men and women who desire their opposites, ultimately demonstrates its own cultural contingency through that very imposition, thus making it a parody in itself of the idea of a natural and primary set of gender roles. To say that heterosexuality is original is to say that homosexuality imitates it, albeit with two members of the same sex playing the roles, read genders, occupied by members of two different sexes who, in the default configuration, are supposed to play those roles. You can see here what we were talking about earlier, how sex is also wrapped up in gendered notions of the proper or default directions of desire, and thus don't just implicate anatomy, but also associated behaviors. Sex, therefore, is itself also constituted as a set of cultural beliefs concerning proper behavior based on one's type as understood within one's society. Now, to be clear, of course sexual dimorphism exists, and the biological conditions of reproduction still exist. Butler is not contesting the fact that human reproduction requires two different gametes, or that, depending on which of these gametes is produced by the body, different bodily features will generally attend them. Judith Butler isn't a moron. The point, however, is that the idea of sex as a primary underlying pre-cultural identity with attendant default behaviors against which one's actual desires and behaviors are measured is itself also gendering. And when we say things like, that's manly behavior for a girl, or what womanly behavior for a man, or when we say that gay men, as biologists and sexologists once did, are attracted to males as straight men are attracted to women, or that the attraction of gay males for men is a feminine trait, since typically women are attracted to men as a part of their reproductive imperative, it becomes readily apparent that, rather than natural and fixed, sex categories, man and woman, the regulatory heterosexual model itself, are all themselves as based upon the performance of repeated acts within a given social grid as any other gender category is, thus revealing the absurdity of postulating heterosexuality as the default through the very process of treating it as such. That is the parody which Butler is talking about. But you don't even need to go that deep into gender trouble to understand that Butler isn't saying that heterosexual relationships are a joke, because Butler literally distinguishes their use of the word parody with that of another theorist, Frederick Jameson, in a footnote to the same page King Critical was reading from. Quote, "If we were to apply Frederick Jameson's distinction between parody and pastiche, gay identities would be better understood as pastiche. Whereas parody, Jameson argues, sustains some sympathy with the original of which it is a copy, pastiche disputes the possibility of an original, or in the case of gender, reveals the original as a failed effort to copy a phantasmatic ideal that cannot be copied without failure." Unquote. For King Critical, therefore, to say as a counterpoint to Butler that, well, my marriage isn't a joke, actually, is so profoundly stupid that it is impossible for me to believe that he read Gender Trouble and actually thought that this was giving a good answer. In sum, not only does King Critical fail to grasp any part of Judith Butler's arguments in Gender Trouble, and not only do the arguments he ascribes to Judith Butler not appear in their book, what he claims Butler says is far more often than not the exact opposite of what Butler is actually arguing. Which raises an interesting question. Why does King Critical get Gender Trouble so completely backwards? It's tempting to say that it's just because he's stupid. That would definitely be an accurate description of his analysis, such as it is. But I don't think that's what's really going on here. I don't think there is anything mentally or physically hindering King Critical from understanding the contents of this book. I don't think he's dumb. Rather, I think the reason why King Critical is so confidently, consistently, and comically incorrect about the words he is ostensibly reading off the page is that he really has no interest in them. He simply has no interest in actually reading the book seriously. Gender is an important, even central component of how we have historically understood our place in society, as well as the place of others who are for various reasons important to us, as people who occupy those places. A female who transitions to identify as a man in public, or a male who transitions to identify as a female, can represent a genuinely destabilizing emotional loss to a parent, a partner, or a child who placed value on that person's femaleness or maleness. Often one's self-worth is dependent upon one's perceived relations to others on the basis of gender. Even today you will see hordes of people online shaming men for not having female partners or children, as these are presumed in some subcultures to be signs of successfully fulfilling the role of a man. Imagine that you've placed your sense of self-worth in having attained an attractive woman as a partner, and suddenly that attractive woman informs you that actually they are not that. There are better and worse ways to respond to a situation like this, and how to cope with loved ones coming out as trans or gay and so on have been discussed ad nauseum in academic literature and in popular discussions online, but I think it's important to emphasize first that these feelings of destabilization, loss, alienation, and the intense anxiety and indeed pain that they can bring are extremely real, and we shouldn't be making light of them. They are problems that need to be addressed. When someone is in this position of having quote-unquote lost someone whose gender played a critical role in their own sense of identity, or when one sees others in this position and proactively fears that they might find themselves in it one day, there are several strategies available to them for how to cope. Some of them are worse than others. The first and best one is to educate oneself, to seriously engage with this new and even frightening phenomenon, and to overcome that fear through confronting it directly and developing understanding and empathy for what right now is so strange and intimidating. This doesn't mean that someone has to agree with whatever any one gender theorist or activist has to say on the matter. Not even Judith Butler has the final say on any of this. For critical theory to adopt a dogma would be to undermine the very spirit of critique, which is above all to investigate and interrogate always. But it does mean engaging seriously, wrestling with hard new ideas, and allowing one's sense of self and how one thinks about the world to grow and even to change as one learns. A second and far worse strategy, and also unfortunately a much more popular one, is to react defensively in advance of any attempt at understanding, and to preemptively seek validation for the presumptions that one is comfortable with against those that are new and discomforting. People who adopt this strategy tend to look for excuses for why the people who make arguments for why gender isn't as natural or fixed as they seemed when they were younger, when the media hid the existence of difference in gender and sexuality from their eyes, are actually perversely motivated by some kind of pathology or malice. They're trying to undermine gender roles, indeed the family, because of their own hatred of America, their own malcontent. They hate wholesomeness because they are envious, because they are perverted, and so on. People who adopt this strategy also like to find ways to make gender activists and theorists appear stupid or crazy. To be fair, sometimes the gender activists like to find ways to do this too. They are only human after all. They will, for instance, find sentences in critical theory books that appear strange, and to take this strangeness as a sign of the book's incoherence. After all, if this sentence doesn't make sense to me, it must be because the book itself is written by an incoherent loon. This is not, at least outside of flat earth societies, a line one often finds in a review of, say, physics textbooks, because of course it is generally correctly assumed that for many topics in physics to make sense, one must usually have spent a significant amount of time actually studying physics. But isn't it strange to assume that philosophy must be immediately accessible to the layperson without any effort, when the topic is precisely the breakdown of language at the frontiers of the engagement of culture with reality? It is genuinely fascinating the reflexive arrogance that so many gender-critical people have when they are engaging with advanced philosophical topics. Why would they assume it would simply make sense to them without doing any field-relevant preparatory study? But I digress. In short, more often than not, people are cowards in the face of scary new ideas that threaten to shake the foundations of the familiar to make way for the new, and to give voice to what has until now been kept conveniently mute. And so they flock to people like King Critical, even though King Critical hasn't been especially successful in getting people to flock to him in particular, because they will put on an academic affectation, albeit one that is frankly comic from the perspectives of actual academics, and give them internal license to ignore the seemingly external sources of their insecurities. In this case, the existence and acknowledgement of gender nonconformists, by mocking it and making it appear silly. And what's important is that it doesn't even matter if King Critical does a good job or accurately represents the arguments he is caricaturing, or whether he even understands a single sentence of what he is reading. Because nobody watches this garbage because they are interested in getting an accurate understanding of the material. If that was so, they would take the pains to be able to read it themselves, and would realize very quickly that King Critical couldn't have possibly actually read it himself, certainly not understood it. Rather, what is actually going on is that the audiences of people like King Critical fear the material. They fear what it means. And what they really want is an excuse to run from it. And they find this excuse in the illusion that the material is simply too silly to be worth the time. This is what King Critical provides, and thus the bulk of his videos are just reading out sentences that appear silly out of context. And it's noteworthy that when he does quote from Gender Trouble, he makes almost no effort to actually show the text of the book from where he is quoting, so that viewers can see the surrounding context for themselves while he is reading. I don't think he's hiding this or obscuring it on purpose. It's just remarkable that he doesn't understand that the context of a sentence inflects its meaning. For someone who calls himself King Critical, he has a remarkably weak grasp of how arguments critique, indeed, of how language works. But without deliberately hiding these quotes, he also does this because he is incentivized to make Butler's arguments appear absurd to his audience. He is rewarded for this, because they can then pretend to themselves that they've heard what Butler has to say and that there's really nothing to worry about. Because, again, they aren't actually interested in understanding what the arguments are. If they were interested, they might wonder for a moment if Butler really wrote a book entirely out of disjointed nonsense statements with no justification, and why an academic establishment that for all intents and purposes didn't even acknowledge trans people's existence at the time would be so excited about a book for that reason when the book doesn't even talk about trans people. Although, if I'm honest, I anticipate that the response will be, it's because of postmodern neo-Marxists in the university, or something like that. In a word, what people get from watching people like King Critical isn't critical analysis at all, surprise, but rather a therapeutic exercise allowing them to feel good about avoiding critical thinking, because critical thinking yields uncomfortable conclusions sometimes. Sometimes it's not so fun. Aversion to the subject is what made these people reflexively, defensively ignorant. Fear itself is what made these people stupid. Isn't that sad? These are all people who could have learned something about themselves and other people. These are all people who could have chosen to engage with the new and the strange, to wrestle with it and to help solve problems, instead of curling up into little balls protecting their imaginary sense of permanence that they already know in the back of their minds isn't going to last. And it's important not to blame them for this. This is a very human problem. Nobody who had a formative influence on their lives told them what actually being brave means. They are a situation too. Now, this isn't to say that there is an onus on the people who are the victims of their bigotry to be gracious and understanding towards people who are actively organizing to erase them. This is just to emphasize that the problem isn't a personal one. There aren't bad guys out there. That's not how this works. Just as there is no doer behind the gender, there is no doer behind the transphobe. They are just what history made them. And they haven't even begun to figure out that there even is a freedom beyond what history made them, much less how to begin to free themselves. People like King Critical, however, are of a different order. These are people who are choosing to attempt to profit from that stultifying fear, and thus they repeat things that produce the repetition of the attendant awards. People like this know when they are cutting corners, when they are feeding garbage to their flock for easy attention and cash. King Critical could have chosen to be someone who teaches frightened people how to think, and he could have done so by example. He knows at the very least how to learn, surely. Instead, he has decided to try and build a brand, giving frightened people the excuses they crave not to think, robbing the opportunity for growth that the challenge of discomfort presents. And how embarrassing for King Critical that now every serious person in the world who recognizes him for what he does now knows which of these things he chose to be. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.